Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of All in All with Alex. I'm your host, of course, Alex, and today we have a very special guest. Y'all know I'm not good at pronouncing names sometimes. Every now and again, I get it right. I'm probably got a 90% success rate. So I'm going to let her introduce herself and give a quick background, and then we'll dive into the questions after.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristina Smeriglio. I also go by Christy. I am a writer and editor, a recently published author of the book Falling into Fire with a background in psychology and NLP. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Alex.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for being here. So let's get into it. So what inspired you to blend your backgrounds in psychology and writing into your work?
So it was really inspired when I was thinking, just to give you a little bit of background, when I was thinking of going to graduate school after having gotten my bachelor's in psychology, I was actually thinking of pursuing a career in psychology, right? Whether it was social psychology or just, I really wanted to assist people like myself who had similar struggles that I did in adolescence and in my childhood and like young adulthood. And I wanted to help them. However, when I was looking into the different programs and what I would be studying and what it would actually entail, like when I actually reflected on what the job would entail, being there 8 hours a day, like back to back, hearing these stories at the time, I was only like 21. And at the time, I was struggling with this idea of like, can I actually help anyone? Especially because I was still struggling at the time dealing with my own, past experiences and things like that. So, I thought about, I'm like, maybe I don't get a graduate degree in psychology. So I was looking into, I did like what they call like soul searching. And I reflected on how much I loved writing and how much writing had helped me to overcome a lot of things growing up. It started in middle school, and then a little bit later on, I took some writing classes, and journaling and writing out my experiences really helped me. So I was like, how about I pursue a writing degree instead, and then see where that takes me, see if I can, write these experiences. I was even going to pursue nonfiction. And when I was completing that program, I realized just how much of my psychology background really helped me. It helped me build characters. It helped me really identify the kind of message I wanted to share in my story. So it was like a very seamless transition from psychology into writing. And I love it. I love building characters who have their experiences and seeing how those experiences shape them, right? And shape how they experience the events of the story and how that background plays a part in it. So it was a very seamless transition for me, and it just made sense, right? I always grew up wondering why people did the way that they did, why did they think a certain way? How did they arrive at those conclusions? So for me, it just made total sense, and I love it.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So, can you tell us about your novel "Falling into Fire" and its connection to um I can't say that Hieronymus Bosch's "The Garden of Earthly Delights"?
Hieronymus Bosch, yes, it's a mouthful. It's one of those like ancient names. Um, yeah, so the connection, well, it was inspired first by because I actually had to write a story in my fiction writing workshop as part of my master's program based on a setting. And at the time, I really didn't know what I was going to write. I was like, do I write about my hometown of Miami? Do I write like a fictional place? And I don't know, I just got this image of that painting that I had seen in actually what my editing design and layout class from the same program. And so I thought about it. I remember looking at the painting and just finding, I actually like ended up getting these like wild visions when I was watching it. Like I just started seeing these scenes. But funny enough, when I tried to write those scenes, I had a hard time because it was actually a male character that I saw first. And for some reason, like I just couldn't really wrap my head around this male character's experience. So I started looking around and I fell onto this female character. And I don't know, just something just clicked. And it was in a way of me, like I inserted myself into the painting in a way, right? So kind of this character served as like an avatar. And so the painting is the setting for the story, right? So my character navigates this particular painting, right? So it's not like once it's in the story has kind of like evolved, but in the book, we kind of have this idea of like, the real person, writer Christy looking at this painting, and then suddenly there's like this avatar type of character in it and navigating in it. So we have these experiences that real life Christy, right? The writer Christy has experienced. And now she kind of has it with her as she's navigating through like this avatar, so to speak. Right. So it's kind of like it's fantasy, but it is inspired by my real thoughts, like the things that I went through. So playing with the characters in the painting, right? So there's different like animals in the painting. There's different like dynamics of the painting. There's like, larger than life animals. Everybody is unclothed, right? Like everybody are just there living naked. So it's kind of like, Garden of Eden. Like if you've ever seen the painting, we have like the Garden of Eden on the left, and in the middle where the story takes place is just like a smorgasbord of like events, right? And there's people engaging in all these different acts, and there's fruits involved and animals. So it's kind of like this chaotic world, and it was the world that I found myself in. So I used those elements of that painting, right, and traveled through it to make sense of the events that I was trying to write about. So it serves as like the literal setting for, right? And I used in my research, right, because I first wrote this story for my master's thesis and it was heavily research based. So I did a lot of research about maybe what the author had intended, right, based on, because it was like from the Renaissance. So what were the messages they were trying to share? What did those symbols mean back then? What they mean now? And just this idea of painting something, biblical and like how it relates to people. So I used a lot of that and a lot of what I understand about, different symbols and things like that to kind of make this new story. And like, so I played with that setting, and it was wonderful. I liked it a lot.
So basically, if I understood you right, basically you were able to write an entire story based off a painting according to a female character that you've seen, and you put yourself basically into the painting per se, and you wrote a story around that.
Exactly. And I feel like it was a way, because I had wanted to write about these ideas before. I was actually going to write my master's thesis. It was going to be like nonfiction, like essay based on talking about the experiences that I struggled with growing up, but that didn't work out. So, I was even having a hard time writing about these things. I was having a hard time facing them, and I really wanted to like get over them. So using this painting and kind of like inserting myself into like a fictional character, it gave me like the safe space to confront these things, right? It gave me a little bit of distance in order to have that, personal growth through that medium. So it was great.
I like that.
Thank you.
That's pretty interesting. It's kind of like a almost kind of like the meta world.
The which one?
The like how people talk about the meta world. It's kind of like a for example, The Sims. You know how they have the
Oh
Sims.
yes.
Yeah, kind
Mm-hmm.
of like a meta world, like
Oh yes.
a digital
Yeah, where
world.
you're kind of playing through these characters. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, all right. So, so what really drew you to study neuro linguistic programming, aka NLP, and how do you incorporate that into your work?
So that actually appeared to me. I was working actually in a law office. So it was a building filled with a bunch of attorneys, and I was a receptionist there. And, I started having conversations with the different employees there, specifically my boss, who was an attorney. And I remember, him like getting to know me. He knew I was in college. And he asked me what I was studying. I was like, oh, I want to study psychology. And he's like, why are you interested in studying psychology? And I remember telling him, I want to know why people do the things that they do. Why are people the way that they are? I wanted to understand people's ways of thinking and how to communicate with them and stuff. So he literally just got a piece of paper for me and he wrote down the letters NLP and he said, look that up and you'll see, and you'll find what you're looking for. So sure enough, I remember like Googling it. This was like back in like 2011, right? 2011. And I remember searching it up and I was like, I want to learn that. I'm like, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I had the means and I signed up for a certification program to get licensed in it. It was like this license to be like a licensed NLP practitioner / motivational coach, which I thought was super interesting. So I registered for that. And then sure enough, when I was completing the program, I realized it gave me like the breakdown, right? Like the technical, I guess, practical breakdown of how our minds work in terms of like language, our patterns, how we perceive information, right? Like when an event happens to us, what's happening in our minds that then leads to our subsequent behaviors. So I remember studying all that and I thought it was fascinating, and it really gave me insight when I started putting into practice and like listening to how people communicated, whether it was they used more visual language, auditory language, right? Like just their verbal preference, the filters that they use, their beliefs, right? When I started to understand that more, it helped me understand myself more, right? And I started practicing that. And then I started injecting into my writing, especially in terms of thinking of audience, right? Like who is my audience and tailoring the language to that. It also helped me get very specific in my language, right? And understanding how to better communicate to relay that message, right? So I always tried to make sure that my language wasn't just, visual or auditory, unless that was like the point I was trying to make, right? Like if that was my specific audience. So I just, it opened up my world with my language and just helping, my character understand, like it helped me understand my character and why she was doing those things, right? Like why was she going through those things, and it helped me create her, in a more developed way. So it definitely found its way into it. And it's in my life every day. I'm very much about like precision questioning, which is something else from NLP. And it's about getting very specific with questions in order to find out, like getting more and more specific depending on what the person tells you, and just making sure that your questions are effective. And my story was filled with questions, so I love asking questions and I love incorporating that. So I definitely found myself embracing that knowledge, as well as psychology, and merging it into the writing.
Okay. I like it. So can you share a memorable experience from your journey as a writer and psychologist?
Memorable moment, I would
Before-
say the first one that comes to mind, and I guess that's probably the one that's most related. When I was writing this story for my master's thesis the first time. So even though the story changed by the time it turned into a novel, I remember writing it for my master's thesis. And there came a point when I had to write a scene where she gets raped, right? Where my main character gets raped. And I remember like sitting on that scene for like 2 weeks. I remember I would open up the computer, I would put the scene up there, like, I had it ready for me to start writing it. And I remember just like not wanting to write it, and I remember avoiding it, like literally, like the plague. And I remember that because, I had to sit and think there, like, Christy, like, you decided to write the story. Like, why are you really writing the story? Are you really ready to overcome this, the series of events that you say you want to overcome? Like, the whole point of you writing this book and, you know, expressing yourself in this way is to actually overcome these difficult situations. But now you have this opportunity, you're just sitting there, right? You're sitting there for weeks, you have a deadline. So it really allowed me to confront myself and to really ask myself, like, am I ready for this? Am I ready to heal? And yes, it took like 2 weeks, right? But eventually I did write it. And then, as the healing continued, right, when it then turned into, from master's thesis to the novel, more started coming up, right? So, but that was, I would say, like the starting point, right? Having that experience and knowing how much it helped me when I finally got over the hump of like starting to write it. Then as more came up, I saw myself opening up more and more. So I would say though, that was kind of like a pivotal moment for me, where I really had to face myself and see, is like, are you really ready for this? So I would say that was pretty memorable.
Okay. So can you discuss the importance? I know you said asking questions was one of the things that you like. So
Yeah.
I guess you can kind of factor that into this question. So can you discuss the importance of effective communication in personal growth?
Yes. I mean, it all comes down to like, if you don't know how to like ask for what you want or share what's really happening, you're never going to get the assistance that you really need, right? We can't rely on people being able to read our minds, right? Everybody has their own filters, their own beliefs that they're registering your information from. Like, you can literally tell them, directly, and they can still maybe not even understand, right? So, but the more effective you are in your language, in your communication, the better it is, the more likely it is that the person that you're speaking to is going to understand you, right? They're going to understand exactly what it is that you're saying. And then if there's something that you need help with, you're more likely to receive it, right? Or if you're being the one that's helping them, right? You need to be able to understand what they're telling you, ask questions if you need more information. So kind of like know how to engage and then use that information to then help them effectively, right? Otherwise, everyone's just going to kind of live in their own little bubbles, like with the filters that they have, the distortions and generalizations that they have, without really communicating. We're all just kind of sharing our experience, but we're not really connecting. So I think the more effective you are in communication, then you can really grow as a person and grow in relationship to others. So I would say that that's like super important.
Okay. So how do you use your holistic approach to help writers overcome creative blocks?
So by holistic approach, I do use, right, the psychology background that I have, the NLP background. I would say NLP more, right? Because I'm understanding what are they thinking, what are they trying to get at, and then just the writing skills. So my main objective is to first understand what someone is trying to say, right? So if they give me something and I don't really understand it, or, I'll ask them questions about their audience, right? Like, what's your main objective? What are you trying to do? Whether it's sell a service, whether it's share a certain theme, right? When it comes to writing, like, let's say more creative writing, I'll ask, what's your ultimate message? Like, what's the ultimate point of this book? What are you hoping people get out of it? Who is your target audience again, right? And then if it was more like copywriting for entrepreneurial, same thing. Like, what are you hoping that the person does after reading this writing, right? After reading this copy. And then based on those answers, then if I'm creating the work, I kind of try to understand, like, use samples from their writing, how they talk to me, right? So I try to pay attention to their language, the words that they're using, things like that. And then I will then either revise writing they've already created or create the writing myself in order to match who they are and what they're trying to get at. If their writing is completely off, I'll sit there and be like, okay, look, based on what I know, this type of writing is going to hit this type of person, right? This person is going to respond to it. Is that exactly who you're talking to? Or is that the person that just agrees with you, right? Like, they already agree with your work, right? So that book maybe not necessarily be for them, right? So if you're trying to reach this person, we might have to tailor the language a little different. Maybe if it was like written too harshly, when it comes to, I remember thinking about writing, let's say that has to do with beliefs, right? If you're trying to reach someone who doesn't believe that, maybe saying it in a harsh way, right? Or just very directly, it may hit, it may not. Most of the time, a lot of people are very strict in their beliefs, right? So we have to be very delicate. You could still end off with more like intense language, right? It's not about changing your personality, but maybe the way that it's structured, or some of the words, right? If some of the words are particularly triggering, right? It's known that people are not going to respond a certain way, research says it. We can tailor that language to that, right? So I really look at things in multiple ways. So I'm not just looking just for grammar. I'm not just looking like, okay, cool, you got your message across. It's like how you're getting across to match the person you're trying to reach, so that you ultimately get the result that you want, which is whether it's they're buying the book, whether they're getting affected by the book in a certain way, if you want them to change their mind, whatever that call to action is, booking your services, right? Whatever that call to action is, I look at things from multiple perspectives to make sure that the writing itself is aligned with that. So I would say that's why, like, where the holistic approach comes in.
So what would you say are some common challenges that you see people face when trying to express themselves through writing?
Well, the first, I would say thinking that they have nothing to say. Like, I struggle with that. When I work with students, particularly like young adults, a lot of times they're like, oh, I don't know what to say. And I'm like, but you've been talking for 10 minutes about it. Like,
Right.
you're literally saying it right now. You know what I mean? I'm like, just pull up a recorder. I always tell them, I'm like, get Otter, get some kind of dictation device. And I'm like, just start talking. Like, you're literally writing, right? So, I would say sometimes like getting out of our own way right? Because we start putting these beliefs in our head, like, oh, I'm not a writer. It's like, you're communicating every day. You just put
Yeah.
it down in writing. It's okay. You know, so
I I think with that, this is just my opinion on just what you were just talking about then, because like I thought about writing a book, and I was like,
Mhm.
then I started thinking like, okay, I can come up with what I want to write about, but I know usually with books they have like a certain structure and
Yeah.
things like that. So maybe they maybe just be talking about like the structuring of it, making sure that they're sticking to whatever chapter. Like this chapter is talking about this. You make sure you stick to that chapter. Maybe they may just be talking about structure wise. I know because
And sometimes they are, but which I tell them, like, that's literally what I'm here for. Like,
yeah,
if it's
exactly.
structure that you struggle with,
That's right.
right? Like I'm like, whether it's I'm in a position of being a tutor, I also work as a professor, an editor. I'm like, if structure is what the struggle is, there are resources, whether it's a person that can help you get it just structured, right? Get it organized. Or, there's plenty of resources online. But I'm like, that, you know, it's a huge part of the writing process, but it shouldn't stop us from writing, right? Because that's something that can always be fixed.
Right.
You cannot fix something that doesn't exist, right? If there's no writing on the page, there's no structure at all, right? So I always tell people, just get the writing on the page and then we can go from there. If you want to outline at first, right? Outlining is another resource that people can do. Be like, okay, let's kind of structure here. I want to talk about a chapter about this, and this, and then you fill it in and then you revise it after that. But I tell people, like, you can't do much if all the ideas are just in your head, right? Like, you have to write something. Later on, you can revise it, review it. If it's garbage, you have to do it again, that's fine. But at least you can see what's on the page and then you can go from there. So I think that that's probably the biggest challenge that I see people face, right? Or thinking that they don't have time. And it's funny, sometimes I used to go through that. I'm like, oh, and what time am I, especially if I'm working full time, I'm like, in what hour am I just going to write creatively? And then, I just like put it into my schedule. I'm like, okay, like, let's time myself. Like, let me just write like a journal, right? Let me just write about my day. Sure
Mm-hmm.
enough, I came with like, 1 to 2 pages in like, I don't know, 5-10 minutes. Like, it was so like seamless, right? I just had to sit there, open up my computer, open up my journal, and then next thing I know, I have plenty of content to work with, right? Whether it's for a blog post, social media, a journal, whether I was writing a scene. Like, I did that a lot writing my book because I did struggle. I'm like, oh, where do I start? And like, it's because I had to expand it, right? I was expanding it from a thesis into a novel. And then what I started doing was like, before I would go to work, I would wake up a little bit earlier. And then I'll be like, okay, my goal is to write 500 words a day. And the next thing I know, I'm like, okay, so I start writing. I think of a scene. I start doing a bunch of things. And when I look at the time, it was like, at most, sometimes it would be like 20 minutes. And then I'm thinking, like, 20 minutes in a day? It's really
Yeah.
not all that much. Like, if we wanted to, we would. You know what I mean? Like, it's really like when we get that out of that idea that it takes so long,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, if you chunk it into smaller pieces a day, like, the book will write itself, right? And anything else that's more technical, or like we're struggling with being organized, like I said, there's plenty of resources, or, seeking help is a great thing. So I would say that's probably like the biggest challenge, more so than anything else.
Okay. Okay. So how do you incorporate elements of psychology into your fiction writing?
Well, I try to think about like stages of development and thinking like how the things that happen to us at certain ages affect things later on. When I was writing about my experiences from adolescence, right, I started to think about, okay, what is like, how would an adolescent respond to this? How would they process it? Right. So I was thinking, so even though I was already an adult writing it, right, I adjusted the character to that of a younger person. I don't specify the age, right? But I kind of put in this like adolescent, teenage, young adults, right? And so thinking about the different stages of development at that age, right? How things affect us at that age, how it leads into adulthood. Some of the different like mental health issues like depression, anxiety, overthinking, things like that. And then just, yeah, thinking about how those traumatizing events lead a person to not engage with the world the same way. When you think about these psychoses, so to speak, and how these traumatic events change a person's brain, it's something that I really wanted to show because, me personally, a lot of people were giving me advice that I think about it now. It's not necessarily that it was bad advice. Like, it wasn't even wrong advice, but it wasn't considering that I had already gone through some pretty rough issues when it comes to, molestation, rape, things like that. And just like not being able to engage with others. I had like really low self-esteem, which I think, was an issue that stems from farther back. So just thinking about, psychologically, what does that do to someone, right? Like when they have these underlying issues, they're not going to engage with the world in the same way. They're not going to receive that advice about relationships in the same way that somebody who didn't experience any of those things. Someone who is experiencing depression or anxiety is going to hear that and they're going to distort it completely, right? They're going to it's overlooking the issue, right? Because if there's this problem with low self-esteem and they're getting pressured, right? Like something that I went through a lot was feeling like the peer pressure, feeling like I had to say yes, even though like inside I was like, no, I'm not comfortable with that. But I felt like I had to say yes, right? I felt like there was this kind of power over me. I felt like, if I don't say yes, like there's going to be a problem here, so that was a distortion. So even though I had the advice, I had information that people had told me, there was something stopping me from just engaging with others in, a healthy way. So, thinking about like what I learned in psychology and just like how those different events shaped who I am, who I became, I use that a lot, kind of like as the background for why she was doing these things, right? Like, why was she caught up in these situations? Why was it like that it didn't just happen once, right? It's one thing if it happens one time, and then it's another thing like it kept repeating itself, right? So I kind of had to really dive into what are the underlying mental health issues and things like that that were preventing her from moving forward. And then, so I definitely wrote that in there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a that can be a lot to unpack sometimes there.
Telling me like like it was unexperienced, but it helped me. It helped me so much, which is why I like to share it. I'm like, I tell them like, even if my book, like to me, it's like a conversation piece. Like it's like an icebreaker almost, right? Like how to actually confront ourselves to overcome things. I feel like that to me is like one of the great values of the story, because, it changed my life. It helped me overcome so much and really heal from certain things. So even though it was incredibly difficult, like I'm not saying I speak about it now, like
yeah.
knowing very well that it's been some time that I've written it. It was very difficult at the time, but once I actually saw it through, like it made such a huge difference. And yes, a lot to unpack, but it was very worth it. I loved it.
That's good. That's the most important part. So, um, what do you feel is the relationship between writing and mental health? Like, do you have any insights on that? Like, what the relationship is between those two? Like, is writing? I guess basically is writing healthy for mental health? You know what I mean? To be able to release that out, because they always say, your mind connects to your hand or something like that to that effect.
Absolutely. I think in a way writing is a mirror, right? When you just allow yourself to express yourself in writing, sometimes even talking, right? Like even when we talk, it's a very clear indication what's happening inside of our minds, unless you're like acting, right? Like in your crafting a certain thing. And even then, right? Like if you're making something up, that still says something about your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
But especially when we're writing, especially when we're journaling, I used to do morning pages, which was, 3 pages of longhand without stopping, not censoring myself every day. And when you write things out, I feel like it is a giant mirror into what's going on, right? When you start finding certain thoughts come up, certain beliefs come up, certain patterns come up, it's a very good indication of what's happening in your mental health. The things that you're mentioning over and over, is a good indication as to what's running in the background when you're not writing, right? When you're just engaging in your regular day. So I think that, journaling and just writing in general is, even the topics that you choose to write about, like whether it's for an essay, whether it's for a story, like if you're choosing to write about something, it's, on your mind. So I think that writing has a lot to do with, it can definitely reveal what's happening in your mental health, and it can also heal your mental health, right? So if you analyze those patterns and then you take, let's say, a new approach, if you need a new approach, even the act of writing about something else can shift, how your mind works and, your overall mental health. So I think it is directly related in those ways.
Okay. Okay. Um, how do you approach the topic of catharsis in your work, both for yourself and for your clients?
Well, for the book, the catharsis really was revealing, right? Actually confronting what was holding her back. Right? I'm not going to say too much about
Yeah.
that. But when it's finally revealed, right, what it actually was, and what are some of the things that were holding the character back, and then writing through that, right? Like actually writing the scene and going through those motions of finishing it, right? Like having this climax, so to speak, right, of overcoming it. It was a catharsis of, it was mental health, it was overcoming these traumatic experiences. So the act of writing allowed me to actually go through the confrontation, right? Like that I maybe couldn't go through in person, right? Like maybe I couldn't engage with that in person. So the act of writing did that. As far as, and that was for myself, right? Like that was my own catharsis where I really got to see, like, why was I so sad for so long? Like, why couldn't I get over it? Why couldn't I heal from this and just have healthy relationships? And then for my clients, if they're writing about something similar, I take a similar approach, very delicate approach. I don't try to force anybody to, overcome something too fast, if that makes sense. I try to like meet them where they're at, right? So I handle it very delicately. But also just for other clients, sometimes they come at me, they're like, I'm not a writer, I don't know how to write, I don't know how to express myself, like I have this kind of business, but like I don't know what to do. And then when I guide them through it, right, sometimes I just guide them through it, whether like sometimes I write it myself, sometimes I guide it through. I like to be very collaborative, like I'll ask them questions so that they're creating the content, and I'll do like interview process. And then when they see the final product and it's ultimately their work, right, like I just facilitated it using my, expertise, I can see like it is in a way cathartic, just like with students who have never written an essay before, and then suddenly they have a 5-paragraph essay or a story, and it is very cathartic for them because it's something they didn't think they could do, or they were so convinced, right? They told me to my face, I don't know how to do this, and then suddenly they're doing it. So, that's how I would say I handle that.
Okay. Um, so what advice would you have for aspiring writers looking to explore complex psychological themes?
I would say, like, I mean, when it comes to writing, you just have to go for it. You just have to like just literally open the book. But I would say really reflect on like your reasoning for why, right? Like what exactly it is that you're called to explore. Psychology is huge, right? There's a bunch of different um, you know, topics in terms of mental health, human growth and development, even to substance abuse. There's so many different things you can tackle. So I would really have the person reflect on why they want to tackle that, right? Like what is calling them to that, and finding that connection, because it is delicate, right? Like our psychology, our mental health runs pretty much all the things that we do, right? Like our task, right? We can write something, we can do something, we can do our job. Our mental health is going to affect that. So I would say anybody approaching it, just really understand like what's the motivation, what are they trying to achieve with it, and look into it, look at it from multiple sides, right? Sometimes we want to look, especially if you're writing about a disorder, it could be tempting to, especially if it's something that it's like really bad that they've struggled with. I think about myself and, talking about topics, such as rape, any kind of violation, right? That like such sexual dysfunction, it helps to try to think about both sides. Even if that both sides doesn't get into the writing, if you try to understand where both people were at in any, like, especially when you're talking about like an event, right? Like you're writing a certain scene. If you try to understand both sides, that's going to give a more clear picture of what's happening, right? Like when you study that principle in psychology, like whatever disorder it is, instead of just being like, oh, this person is a narcissist, right? Like if you look beyond that, right, into some of the background and what leads to that and what could trigger those things and how it triggers the other person, when you really dive into it, like, and take that holistic approach, you're going to get something that is a lot more helpful, right? Just pinpointing disorders, like there are a bunch of books that can tell you, oh, that looks like this. That's not what we're doing, right? If you're going to tackle it in terms of writing in order to like overcome it or to share a story, I think that having those layers to what a person is experiencing can be really helpful. That's what I would say. Just think it through. See beyond what may be obvious.
Do you feel like living in Miami influenced your writing and perspective on human experiences?
Yeah. I mean, like, I would say, especially the events in the story that I wrote, it's funny. I when I had my like book party, I had like a book reading. When I lived in Texas and I had it there, because I was there for a while. And when we ended up having like this Q&A, we were talking about it. And, my Hispanic background plays a huge part in understanding like why these events happen. Even though parents may say like, okay, you're focusing on your school, things like that, but then you go to Thanksgiving party and you have an aunt telling you like, oh, like, where's the boyfriend? And you're a teenager and you're like, I don't have a boyfriend, but there's like this pressure. And I know that men, right, like, back then, like young guys go through that too. Like there's like this sense of like, how many girls have you been with? Oh, like, well, let me take you here to the wilderness because you need to grow up. You're 15 years old, but you need to be a man. And there's so many elements like that, that the Hispanic culture, whether it's intended or not, it's kind of like into our fabric, right? And then at the same time, there's this element of, oh, but like you can't be too easy. You have to play hard to get. But then it's like, you need to get a boyfriend, but you have to do this. And it's like, there's a lot of factors. I feel like I can talk a lot about that. But like it's ultimately that Miami living, because it's at least in my area, right, where the things that I was dealing with, the Hispanic background, there's a lot that, whether or not we realize it, impacts young people. And especially like teenagers, they're very impressionable. They feel that pressure, and you're getting pressure just like even hormonally, right? Because then you're getting told certain things, but you're feeling it biologically too. So it's very difficult to, especially when you're forming your personality at that age. And you're having all these influences of like people in Miami, or things are like, I feel like flying like fast and loose, you know what I mean? Like, and that may not be what you want, but it's what's around you. And there's a lot of substances around you, whether it's actually around you, you just hear about it because like they're common in this, vicinity, I feel. So it can put a lot of pressure on a young person who's still forming, like, and trying to understand what it is that they really want. Which was the experience for me. Like, I knew what I wanted, but I felt all this pressure. So then I was acting completely against what it is that I wanted. I wanted a healthy relationship. I wanted love. And yet that's not what was happening to me, and I didn't, and that's where the struggle came. So I definitely think that living in Miami, just having that influence around, even the music, like just the vibe in general, it does put a lot of pressure onto people to be a certain way, to look a certain way. When then you grow up and I'm like, why did I struggle so much? Like I could have like been spared of so much horror, like now that I'm grown up and I don't let it affect me as much. But when you're young, it does affect you a lot more. So I would say it definitely affected how I grew up and how I responded to difficult situations, for sure.
Okay. What role would you say that empathy plays in your work as a writer and tutor?
Well, really understanding with writing, well, just putting myself in that person's shoes, like when I utilize that character as an avatar and just seeing what she was going through, even though it matched my experiences, there was a difference, right? Because it was through another setting. So really getting into her head and just feeling what she was feeling helped me develop the character and helped me develop the other characters around her. Even though it was first person, I needed a sense of empathy, because otherwise there's no way I could have written her in a real way to like get that first person point of view. So I would say like just I literally put myself in her position and navigated that scene. As far as being a tutor, I like this first happened to me as a teacher, right? I wasn't studying to be a teacher. I ended up just like falling into teaching. I taught at a K through 12 school, and I was working with students that had special needs, right? Like different intellectual abilities, different emotional abilities and struggles and dynamics. And it was a real wake up call for me when I was teaching like spelling or teaching reading, or even watching another teacher spend 10 minutes explaining a math problem. And then when they were asked to do it themselves, like they could not. Like they could not do it. And it was as a result of their intellectual disability, right? Their intellectual difficulty. And when it occurred to me, and mind you, growing up, I was in the gifted program. So even though I thought differently, certain academic, concepts were quick for me, right? Like I may have struggled in other ways, but academically, I was relatively quick. And the people around me, because we were all in the same class, like I never knew too many people that really struggled at that level. And so seeing it as a teacher, I'm like, it took me a while. I was like, I don't understand. Like, cat is CAT, like even something as simple as that, or like you read a paragraph and they just could not grasp like what the paragraph was about, even though we just read it 2 times. When I really understood, like, there are certain things impeding them from understanding it, and they are making their effort, right? So then I started looking at them like more for that, right? Like they're really, they're overcoming it, they're persevering. And I got to appreciate different intellectual abilities because now I was like an adult. So as a tutor, keeping that in mind, especially now, I work with students at Miami-Dade College, and a lot of them, English is not their first language, so there they are trying to write a paragraph for the first time as an adult, right? Because maybe in their country, they never had to do that. Or even students that were raised here, their program, right? Like they did it somewhat, but really, or maybe they missed the assignment completely. So there was a lot of skills that were missing. So just putting myself in their position to be like, okay, like this person maybe doesn't get it, right? But they are trying, right? As long as they were making the effort, I was able to put myself in their shoes and like really help them just attempt, whatever task that they were doing. Without that, I would have gotten so much more frustrated. I'm like, why don't you understand? Right? But and that would have made me a really horrible teacher and tutor, which was the complete opposite intent. So when I really just like opened my eyes to just the different abilities that were out there and the different experiences that people came with, it was definitely, I was able to really help people, and it was great.
Okay. So last question before we get up out of here. What message do you hope that readers take away from your work?
That you can literally overcome anything. Like it doesn't matter how horrible an experience was. If you're willing to face it, right? If you're willing to look at it, to look at yourself, to be honest with yourself, right? As to the part, if there's a part that you played in it, right? If you're able to really look at yourself honestly, to look at the experience honestly, to look at it from multiple angles, and really just view it honestly and have that intention to overcome something, you can definitely overcome anything and move on from it in life.
So, anything else that you would like to share with the audience before we wrap things up?
Not really. I just think, for listeners out there, whether they're into writing, into mental health, I think that curiosity is a big thing, right? If you're willing to be curious, if you're willing to ask the right questions and to really put yourself out there, if there's anything that you want to achieve, like I say just go for it. Ask and you will receive. I just say go for it. Just want to say, like, have that motivation. And if it's inside of you, if you're feeling called to write or to look into psychology or NLP or anything like that, I would say listen to that calling and just see where it takes you.
Okay, cool. So I want to take this time to tell you, Kristina, that I thank you for coming on the show,
Thank you.
talking with the audience. Letting them know your story, letting them know about the NLP, letting them know about your novel, things of that nature, and I mean, talking about how you help people, with their writing and things like that, and how you help tutor people and stuff like that. So, anybody that's watching, I would like for you all to go support Kristina in every way possible. I'm going to put all her information in the show notes for the audio version and in the description for the video version. So you guys go support her, whether you follow her on social media, interact with her posts, purchase her book, her novel. I mean, you know what I mean? So just support her because she definitely deserves it.
Oh, thank you. I
No problem.
appreciate
No
that,
problem.
Alex, a lot. Thank you.
No problem. So everybody that's watching, thank you all again. You all have just watched another episode of All in All with Alex, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Bye.